If the squadron commanders were tormented by the question of how to drop more bombs on the target, the commander-in-chief had quite different concerns. We learned from reliable sources that he spent all his time sitting behind a desk interviewing pilots, cursing scientists, and bringing group commanders down to the ground to get information on the results of bombing raids. Why did the raid on Bremen conducted last night fail? Because the crews couldn't see the ground. Why can't they fly blind? Because they can determine their position with an error of 20 miles or more. Why? Because the Germans jam all our radio beacons. Why weren't flares fired over Bremen? Maybe they were, but the enemy put up such a thick smoke screen that ours could not see anything at all. Why of those bombs that were still dropped close to the target, most of them fell southwest of the target? Because after takeoff the wind changed, but no one informed the pilots about it. Day after day after day, he was interested in everything. All forces were thrown into finding a way that would allow a large group of bombers more accurately drop bombs on the target, while avoiding unnecessary destruction. Finally, a plan was hatched. During my absence, the squadron had lost many pilots, some permanently, but new ones had arrived. The training units sometimes produced some pretty good stuff. Bunny Grain, Wimpy Wellington, Johnny Coates, Taffy Williams, and Ginger Crowfoot, who had arrived in the last few weeks. They were yet to go down in history as the greatest men of 106th Squadron. From the very beginning, they set about photographing the aiming point, and the pictures they took placed the squadron in an honorable 7th place in all of Bomber Command. They owed much of their skills and achievements to an excellent squadron leader who had just arrived to take the vacant seat. His surname was Woolridge, however, hardly anyone called him that. Since he had just started flying, everywhere and anywhere he was known as Dim. He had a huge mustache and sharp facial features. Dim's behavior could astonish anyone. As soon as he arrived at our place, he immediately tried to write a concerto for piano and orchestra. I think he wanted to find an excuse not to spend too much time with the boys. Dima had stomach problems and couldn't drink much, so he always had an excuse. He had to sit in silence in his office at the music paper. He didn't have time to drink beer. His other weakness was poetry. Still, Dim was in all other respects a fine man. Among other things, he flew 67 sorties to Germany. Dim was very kind to his lads, but I'm afraid not too deferential to the squadron commander. Although I didn't admit it out loud, I think he needed supervision. When we reached Antwerp, we were ordered to return. The cloud layer that was supposed to protect us was beginning to melt away. The sky had cleared enough, and we could see as far away as we wished. Not a very pleasant position to be in when you're alone. As soon as we received our orders, we immediately turned around and sped toward Vlissingen. We hoped to attack a steamer of 4,000 tons displacement that was coming within a mile of the shore, but the same thing was attempted by another Lancaster, which was flying a mile ahead of us. Knowing full well that we were already being chased by Luftwaffe fighters, I ordered him by radio to come closer so that we could support each other with the fire of our machine guns. We flew along with him until some clouds appeared. And then Johnny was the first to spot another plane that was about to attack some ship. "Look, it's the O-Orange," he announced. Straining my eyes, I recognized Dim sitting in the cockpit. His huge mustache was sticking out to the sides, and the flight engineer was handing him a cigarette. Noticing us, Dim smiled. Then he realized who was flying next to him and immediately spun into the cloud. "Yeah, it was the O-Orange," I told the guys. "But someone claimed the airplane was malfunctioning, wasn't it?" Now and then some unfamiliar faces appeared in the squadron, whose appointment Dim made without even letting me know. These were the guys he wished to have by his side. But in spite of everything, Dim was a great guy. He did a lot for his squadron. For too long, all of us, and me included, fought only about the tonnage of bombs dropped, without paying any attention to the accuracy of bombing. However, Dim organized several night bombing raids and made the guys practice taking pictures almost every night. At that time, We had no way of satisfactorily solving the problem of destroying said targets. The American Air Force did not yet have a significant force in Europe. The only thing we knew was that they had a new bomb sight with which they could put a bomb literally on a tea saucer. But for the time being, Bomber Command had to take the fall for everyone. During this period, the most formidable remained the underwater danger. The enemy was building submarines faster than we could sink them. Work was boiling both in German ports and in the territories captured by the Germans. Danzig was one such port. Danzig was in Poland, very far from Britain's shores, but we had to try to help our fleet in the Battle of the Atlantic. Therefore, a daylight raid was planned on this port, where at least 12 submarines were being built every month. To accomplish the task, it was decided to attract Lancasters. In this case, the planes had to fly 1,500 miles over enemy territory during the daytime. If we could bomb at night with sufficient accuracy, the operation could be carried out with minimal risk. However, a special order had been issued requiring that civilian casualties be avoided at all costs, so we had to accept the added risk of flying over enemy territory without fighter cover. Not much can be said about the raid itself. Our sniper bombing was appreciated with only a few lines in the newspaper. Yesterday, our Lancasters made a daylight raid on Danzig to carry out an attack on enemy submarine yards. Many searchlights were destroyed by the gunners. Yes, there were a lot of anti-aircraft guns and searchlights because we missed the timing by a large margin. Most of us arrived at Danzig when it was already quite dark. Personally, instead of bombing Danzig at night when you couldn't see anything in the harbor, I dropped bombs on a small ship standing on the outer roadstead. The altitude was 1,000 feet. The miss was 20 yards. We saved civilian lives, and at the same time learned that raids should be planned carefully. At this time, rumors began to circulate that a target squadron, or Pathfinders, was beginning to be formed, to which the best crews from all squadrons would be selected. Dim said, "That doesn't sound like a bad idea to me, but I foresee a lot of problems." "What will they do?" someone asked. "Approach at low altitude and illuminate targets with missiles. We'll stay higher in complete safety and bomb aptly," Johnny said. "That's good. That's fine." "Yes, but I repeat, there will be difficulties," said Dim. "First of all, it's difficult to form a new squadron from scratch. If you rush it, it will turn out badly. And they want to rush it. I think it would be better to take the best squadron of Bomber Command and rename it the 1st Pathfinder Squadron." "That means us," Tuffy remarked. "No, we're only ranked 5th. I guess the best one is the 97th. After a short argument, everyone agreed that the 97th Squadron was the better choice. "The second problem will be casualties," Dim continued. "If they intend to operate at low altitude, their losses will be too high, too much. How do they expect to deal with that? Training new crews will take time. The squadrons will give them their best crews, but on a strictly voluntary basis," Wimpy suggested. "Then the best squadrons would simply be deprived of select crews. Or there won't be any volunteers, and the Pathfinders will die out on their own." "That's right. Smart commanders will hold on to the best crews and shove them down the scale. The bad ones will do nothing and suddenly turn into the best." "It's war," Dim said. "It won't all be figured out until many, many days from now. But there's a third problem, as far as I can see. Whether there will be high casualties or not is not yet known. What is clear, however, is that the best pilots in their squadrons who qualify for the squadron commander's position will be turned into private pilots at the Pathfinders and will lose the opportunity for promotion. Their places will be taken by the remaining middlers. And that doesn't seem fair to me. "But that goes for all the special operations squadrons," I pointed out. "I understand. But in any case, I wish they'd hurry up. We really need to improve our bombing accuracy." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. And in Bomber Command, the arguments and strife continued to simmer. Some of the big shots couldn't wait for the day when the Pathfinders would make their first sortie. This company included most of the air group commanders. But others, including officers on the command staff, continued to have doubts. The idea seemed too bold. Why change a system that had worked well or poorly for 3 years? They argued and bickered and argued, wasting time. Even the Prime Minister was involved, and in the end it was he who made the final decision, which turned out to be the right one. On August 15, 1942, the Pathfinders made their first appearance. However, let's go back a few days. On August 9 and 10, we were all busy laying mines in the Baltic to prevent the Prince Eugen from slipping out into the Atlantic. These were long flights, 7 or more hours, and the weather left much to be desired. Spending 15 hours in the air a day is too much for the average pilot. The weather was so bad that after takeoff, we were immediately in a cloud before we could even retract the landing gear. On our return, we had to land necessarily in daylight. On August 11, we rested, and the next night we conducted the last raid in Germany that did not involve Pathfinders. By the way, it was my birthday. That's probably why the raid was a complete success. We destroyed 135 acres of structures. Each crew ducked below the clouds to find their target and dropped bombs from 5,000 feet. I can't escape the thought that the guys tried to give me a gift, but the result was that the Naces got the gift. However, having flown 4 sorties in 5 days, we were all very tired, and the squadron was given a day's rest. We went to our pub, the Red Lion, and had a pint of beer. The next day, we found out which squadron had been selected to operate the Pathfinders as part of the 5th group. A guy who was in that squadron had landed at our airfield the previous night due to engine trouble. He told us everything he knew. We are due to fly south tomorrow, somewhere in Huntingdonshire. I suppose it'll be a nice place. There's great beer and pretty girls there. Anyway, we'll all be glad to get out of Lincolnshire. Fine, Dim agreed dryly. But what are the conditions of service in the Pathfinder compound? As far as I know, we have to make 60 sorties without a break too. However, we are given rest when we are exhausted, and no one has yet called it lack of courage. When you get the rank of Pathfinder, that means 10 sorties as an illuminator. You are allowed to wear a special pair of gold wings under your order ribbons. A chorus of sarcastic exclamations was heard in response. What does it mean to be an illuminator? Let me elaborate a little on everything. The new crews carry only incendiary bombs at first, no flares at all. However, they have to attack before the main force shows up, so the first incendiaries fly straight at the target. The next group of crews takes only flares. These guys have to find the target, and we call them bloodhounds. They have to keep an exceptionally accurate course while trying to fly on the reckoning. At exactly the estimated time of arrival, they start firing rockets every 30 seconds. The rockets illuminate a large area of terrain about 10 miles long. Meanwhile, the rest of the bloodhounds deploy on either side of this line. So by the time the attack begins, about 10 square miles are illuminated. That's not too good, but it's enough for the next group of guys. What about the best crews? I asked. They carry cassettes of rockets that they fire the moment they see the aiming point. In reality, they try to put the missiles right on that very point. They fly right behind the bloodhounds and call themselves illuminators. When they see the target, they fire a special series of rockets. The rest of the Pathfinders immediately pull up there and hang hundreds of missiles over the target, which will hopefully illuminate the target as if it were daylight. What about the clouds? That's a question we don't know the answer to ourselves yet. But the first thing we're going to start doing is to send out a mosquito scout every night, about an hour before our planes take off. It should find out exactly what the weather conditions are over the target. We might start sending out a weather scout 5 hours before takeoff to be absolutely sure that the weather will allow us to attack the target. And fog. Well, if the fog is thick enough, we drop pansies. It's a 250-pound incendiary bomb that burns bright red on the ground. It can be easily distinguished even through the thickest fog. How long does it burn? Long enough, as much as 15 minutes. That sounds reasonable. And at what altitudes do you operate? The same as you. We can fly lower if the clouds are coming in low enough. But the most important thing that dictates our actions is the need to be absolutely certain of our coordinates. But how can you know exactly where you are? The Germans jammed the radio beacons of our fleet. With their help, we can only locate ourselves over the North Sea and no farther. We must perfect blind flight by instruments and calculus. Flight by reckoning is our motto. We try to determine the strength and direction of the wind as accurately as possible. In this case, if the pilot is good and the instruments are in good working order, for 300 miles of flight, the error will be no more than 10 miles. Well, then the bloodhounds do the rest. That looks attractive, agreed Hobby. However, we still don't have an aiming point. That's true. The bombs are always scattering, but at least over the right spot. Yes, if everything works out, over the right one. I hope so, Dim said, not hiding his doubts. 2 days later, the Pathfinders led a compound of bombers on a not-so-subtle raid on Emden. That port wasn't very large, and it wasn't covered by many anti-aircraft guns, so even a successful raid was unlikely to do much good. However, the operation was necessary to give the Pathfinders confidence. They illuminated the target well, and the bombs landed accurately. The people of Emden had never seen such devastation until now. We did not participate in this operation, as well as in subsequent raids, as we were involved in special assignments. This story began long ago, when our Shavy Hamptons were still used for single dive attacks against the Scharnhorst in the harbor of Kiel. Now the Scharnhorst was in Guinea, and new equipment was being installed. There also stood the decommissioned Gneisenau together with the new aircraft carrier, Graf Zeppelin, which was preparing for its first campaign. Admirals of the Royal Navy feared that these ships, together with the battleship Tirpitz and several cruisers, could form a strong operational connection, which would break into the Atlantic, where their presence was highly undesirable, especially because several extremely important operations were scheduled to take place. Meanwhile, after the memorable breakthrough of the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau across the English Channel, scientists were brought in to create a new type of bomb. It was called simply the battleship bomb. The details of its design and mode of action remain a secret even today. But for simplicity's sake, it can be said that a single hit was supposed to put a battleship out of action. The bomb was quite heavy, but like any new weapon, it was not yet free from disadvantages. It looked rather clumsy and resembled a turnip. Like any turnip, its ballistic qualities left much to be desired. When dropped from a high altitude, instead of flying like a normal bomb, it willingly changed its trajectory. Therefore, to hit a ship from 8,000 feet required a fair amount of luck in addition to the skill of the bombardier. The only alternative was a low-altitude approach. Unfortunately, this bomb had to be dropped from exactly 1,000 feet, or it might not work. Therefore, the pilot had to fly over the battleship strictly horizontally at an altitude of 1,000 feet. Most ship's gunners would agree with me that under such conditions only a few Lancasters would be able to reach the bomb drop point. Air Marshal Harris turned this toy over to my squadron. We were ordered to conduct bombing exercises from low and high altitude. 2 special bomb sites were purchased for this work. The Ministry of Aviation Industry, which had long ago learned to make excellent airplanes, now began to produce very useful devices for them. 2 types of fine sights began to be supplied to bomber squadrons. The high-altitude sight was quite different from the low-altitude sight, but in any case we didn't carry bomb sights too much, because night bombing didn't require much marksmanship. We were quite satisfied with a bomb placed in a circle of a quarter-mile radius. However, the altitude sight in question was really accurate. When we began to practice using it, we quickly learned to put bombs in a circle of 60 yards radius from an altitude of 10,000 feet. This was sufficient for our purposes. Training went on for 2 months without a break, and 6 crews in our squadron became real snipers. When the cloud cover was low, we practiced bombing from low altitude and learned to put bombs in a circle of 15 yards radius. If the German ships tried to take cover under the clouds, we would still get them, although it would not be easy. During the last 2 months, we had to keep 3 crews each on constant alert. They could take off as soon as they got the order. Sometimes I myself had to be on duty as well. However, no matter how good pilots we were, I must admit frankly that my boys survived only because none of the German admirals had the courage to go to sea. One thing is clear: if we have to take off and attack those ships, someone will get the Victoria Cross posthumously, Dim remarked. And who's the first? Tuffy asked. Not me, replied one of the boys. All I want is peace and the Victoria Medal. And most of us agreed. And then came the moonlit August nights. Our intelligence reported that work on the Graf Zeppelin was almost complete. It was assumed that the crew was already on the ship, the airplanes were in hangars, and everything was ready to go to sea. The German aircraft carrier was a thing we hadn't encountered before, and it was good not to encounter it for as long as possible. We knew how to drop the new bombs, and we were ready. The full moon of August 27 came. While the other guys were bombing Kassel, the 12 machines of our squadron made the 950-mile trip to Guinea. We took off with an unheard-of overload. The planes were pulling 67,000 pounds. Flying with me as bombardier was Major Richardson. He served as an instructor, and if anyone could drop a bomb accurately, it was him. For Richardson, however, this was the first flight since 1918. We planned to make 2 runs at 6,000 feet. It was supposed to be easy. The piers in the bright moonlight were supposed to look like clear black rectangles in the sights. Everything seemed to be working out in our favor. Of the 12 bombs, at least one should definitely hit the target. But the old weather lady had played tricks on us again. When we appeared over the target, it turned out that the southwest wind had gathered all the fog from central Germany and drove it to Danzig and Guinea. Visibility had dropped to 1 mile. Moreover, there were more than enough anti-aircraft guns and searchlights around. Hoppy proved to be the most accurate. His bomb fell 50 yards from the target, creating the deepest crater in the area. We spent over an hour over the target and made 12 passes, but we never once saw the Graf Zeppelin. Yet the Gneisenau was there and Dickie Richardson was aiming at it. Every time we came in on target, he completely ignored the anti-aircraft guns around him. I suppose he felt like he was working on a training ground. The first time, he dryly reported, "False approach," and the response was silence. When he repeated the same thing a 10th time, tail gunner Johnny Wickens couldn't contain his feelings. Finally, we saw the huge bomb drop into the water about 400 yards from the Gneisenau. Dick's replica was brief and emphatic, as we were over the target alone and dozens of shells were tearing around. He said, "We served the bastards a mass of fresh fish." He thought for a moment and added, "What a sod." Combi, sitting in the middle tower, said he thought we ought to get out soon. The boy reported that we would cross the Danish coast in the afternoon. Hutch stated that he would send a radiogram saying that we had just left our target, so the base would not be concerned when we were a few hours late. The boy intervened again and said we should take a little north so we could go around Zilt on the way back. We could run into fighter planes there. I said nothing or almost nothing. Just a few short words. That's the nasty part. One big bomb. You take a long trip, you do your best, and you smear. And then you still have a 5-hour flight home. It's an exciting endeavor. As we circled over the base, I looked at my watch. We had been in the air for 10 hours. Even though I didn't have a co-pilot, I felt pretty good. 10 hours of flying is a very long time. But other than our miss, the only event worth mentioning was the Russian raid on Königsberg, conducted at the same time as our raid on Guinea. In the bright moonlight, I saw a strange silhouette, somewhat resembling an elongated Heinkel. And the next day, some correspondent wrote in the newspaper about an aerial handshake over Danzig. I am quite sure that neither side suspected the operation of the other. A few days later, we followed the Pathfinders to bomb Saarbrücken. For the first time, we were carrying an 8,000-pound bomb, and were therefore in a state of nervous excitement, as we were very anxious to see what it could do. We had never followed the Pathfinders before, so we made sure to fly in a little early to see how they would work. We saw the trackers hang their lantern alley, with the illuminators circling nearby. Then they set up huge chandeliers over the city, and the bombs begin to burst on the ground. The lighters come down thickly at first, probably about 1,000 tons in total. Soon the whole place is a solid sea of fire. The boy says he saw a heavy bomb fall. After the explosion, a mushroom of blue-red flame rose up, which seemed to cover an area of half a square mile. I didn't try to verify whether this was true. Everything was going fine. We made it back safely, although many of us brought back quite the largest wing and fuselage breaches I've ever seen in a Lancaster. But we went to bed with a feeling of deep satisfaction. All the pictures showed a solid wall of fire. But the next day, the photo reconnaissance planes brought some very bad news. The Pathfinder formation had disgraced itself. They had designated as a target Saarlouis, a small town that was 10 miles from Saarbrücken. The guys in the reconnaissance squadron reported that, judging from the photos, there was not a stone left unturned there. Our 1,000 tons of bombs just wiped that town off the face of the earth. A few days later, the same thing happened again in Frankfurt, when a small group of bombers, missiled by Pathfinders, bombed a small town near there. But this time, they mistakenly destroyed a previously unknown Opel truck factory. But if some of the raids failed, the rest went well. The Pathfinders were already beginning to justify the investment. The unit was commanded by Colonel Bennett, a former civilian line pilot. The destruction of the industrial areas of many cities was taking place on a scale never seen before. Crews were finally able to see exactly what they were aiming at. The day came when most of the bombs began to fall where they were supposed to. But unfortunately, the area was too vast, so the bombing was still not massive. The bombers needed markers so they could aim right at the bullseye. It soon became apparent that the pansies were of little use. The Germans reacted quite quickly. They copied these lighters and began seeding forests and fields with them. The struggle continued, but the first step in the right direction had been taken, and new changes were made almost every day. The cities of the Third Reich were raided every night, but my flight book shows that these raids were not always equally successful. September 10, Dusseldorf. Target well covered, destroyed most of the industrial area. September 13, Bremen. Failure. We lost 19 airplanes, including 3 machines from 106 Squadron. Tuffy Williams. Dizzy Downer, Major Howell, mostly from anti-aircraft fire. Target unlit, bombed as they went. September 19, Ruhr area. Clouds all the way, total failure. September 23, Flensburg. Failure, mainly due to fog. Bombing not massive. It was clear that we still had some difficulties to overcome. We could do anything we wanted, but we still had no control over the weather. When the weather was good, the raid was successful. When the weather was bad, bombs flew left and right. On October 1, we relocated to another airfield. As soon as we arrived there, we immediately began training and bombing from low altitude in large groups. They were led by a very capable officer, Colonel Gus Walker. Walker was well known because he had already earned the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Flying Cross. He taught us how to navigate during night flights at near zero altitude. There is simply not room in this book to describe all of Gus's virtues, but I do know that the entire 106th Squadron considered him one of the finest base commanders we had to serve with. At first we flew in squadrons, then we moved on to flying as a wing, and finally as a group, which we called a goose pack. We flew up and down all over England, never going above 300 feet. It was exceptionally dangerous. At first we didn't know how to hold formation, and flew nearly touching each other with the tips of our wings, like a crowd of laborers walking to the bus. The only problem was that someone might actually touch a neighbor. When we started doing practice bombing drills, all we had to do was close our eyes and pray. The practice bombs were whizzing around like that. George Lace, who usually flew to my left, He even managed to catch one mid-tower. The bomb slipped between the gunner's legs without even scratching him, which surprised everyone. Very often the fighters covering the metropolis used us as targets for training attacks. They found that it was very difficult to get out of the vortex trail of our formation if you happened to be in it. More than one fighter crashed during these training attacks. It all culminated in the largest daylight raid of the war. 94 Lancasters flying in close formation. In my opinion, it was a perfectly planned and perfectly executed raid. My report, written the next day, while I was still under the impression of the events, read: For several days, the squadron has been practicing group flights at low altitude over beacons. It was quite clear that such exercises were to culminate in something big, clearly out of the ordinary, probably a major daylight raid. After several halts, when the planes had to be disarmed, as soon as the bombs were taken on board, there came a day when all conditions were favorable for carrying out such an attack. That day was Saturday, October 14, 1942. The target was the Schneider armament factory at Le Creusot, almost on the border of unoccupied France. The raid was conducted by only the 5th Group, a large formation of 94 Lancasters. They completed their formation just after noon. From the composition of our squadron in the raid participated in 10 aircraft, and all of them took off without incident. We flew over Cape Land's End, over the Bay of Biscay, then turned to the coast of France, crossed it near the island of Ile d'Ye, and then flew about 200 miles over enemy-occupied territory. The formation flew all the way at an altitude of from 50 to 500 feet, rising to 4,000 feet only in the target area. When we arrived there at about 6 p.m., the sun was already setting and dusk was beginning to thicken. However, the factory and warehouse area was still visible quite clearly. The attack lasted only 9 minutes. During this time, more than 200 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs were dropped with exceptional accuracy. The strongest fires started. Terrible explosions were visible throughout the factory. In a few minutes, the whole city was covered with a thick shroud of black smoke. In addition to the main forces, the attack involved another 6 Lancaster, which separated to bomb the power plant Montchenin. The destruction of this important target was to increase the chaos. The 106th Squadron was represented in this group by Lieutenant Colonel G. Gibson and Captain J. W. Hopgood. The attack was launched from an altitude of 500 feet, each plane carrying 10 500-pound bombs. Both crews claimed to have hit the target, which was later confirmed by intelligence. The transformer station had to be repaired for almost 2 years. While our 2 airplanes were over the target, the gunners fired over 1,000 rounds at the transformer station. It was a spectacular operation. Each time a bullet hit the target, it was accompanied by a bright blue flash. The attack ended to the complete satisfaction of all involved, and the planes turned for home. Singly, for it was already dark, and for the same reason all flew the shortest route. The weather, which had previously been favorable, now deteriorated sharply, and most of the planes had to land at bases in southern England. During the whole operation, no enemy fighter aircraft attempted to attack us, and the air defense of the facilities was quite weak. All of the squadron's planes made it back in one piece, with the exception of Lieutenant Colonel Gibson's plane and Captain Hopgood's plane, which was damaged by the shock wave of its own bombs. Captain Hopgood, for whom, coincidentally, this was the last flight of the operational cycle, had exercised insufficient caution and dropped his bombs below a safe altitude. All 10 crews of the squadron claimed to have hit the target, so from the squadron commander's point of view, the raid was a complete success. Due to insufficient light, the bombers were unable to take pictures of the results of the attack, but Lieutenant Ruskell, who was on the plane of the wing commander, on the way back managed to capture something with an ordinary movie camera. These few shots proved to be the only documentary evidence and were later published in the newspapers. The following pilots of 106 Squadron participated in the raid: Lieutenant Colonel Gibson, Lieutenant Crow, Sergeant Lace, Lieutenant Shannon, Sergeant Hamilton, Captain Hopgood, Lieutenant Castles, Lieutenant Healy, Sergeant Fair, Lieutenant Wellington. 2 days later, we were assembled for a briefing before raiding Italian territory. After some interval, the raids on that country were resumed, as flying over French territory was no more dangerous than flying over England. The pilots loved such operations. "Genoa tonight," said Gus Walker. "I won't waste time making a long speech, but this is the first time we'll be bombing Genoa after a long break. The target, of course, will be the port where the Italian Navy ships are harboring. You may wonder why we're suddenly abandoning Germany and why you're flying tonight. I would very much like to be with you. Well, the only thing I can tell you is that this raid will be part of a major operation in the Mediterranean. For the first time in history, you'll be supporting an army hundreds of miles away. But anyway, go ahead. Good luck." We all took off, and we all headed back. It wasn't a bad spanking. The efforts of the pathfinders over the targets were as bright as day. We saw our lighters blazing furiously on the tiled roofs of Genoa's houses. We saw heavy bombs demolish the structures in the harbor. When we turned back, we figured Genoa had gotten a good one. And the next day, word came that our troops had launched an offensive in the western desert. Gus turned out to be quite right. It had been a great week from the very first day. The very next day, we made another raid into Italian territory, this time during daylight hours. Apart from direct destruction, I believe these raids convinced the Italians that the Royal Air Force dominated the air on the Western Front. We intended to attack Milan. It should not be thought that the German fighters allowed us to fly through French territory quite unhindered. We crossed the strait at low altitude and entered French territory between Cherbourg and Le Havre. We were told that there was a warm front over France that would cover us as we flew to our target. In reality, the cloud layer turned out to be quite liquid. We flew over the coastal cliffs and saw some questionable clouds in the distance in the bright sunshine. Most of us had to fly over France for quite a while before the clouds welcomed us into their affectionate, motherly embrace. The Germans shelled us over the coast, but I think they were greatly surprised to see hundreds of bombers flying at low altitude under cover of Spitfires. Then we heard the Germans talking on the radio. The guidance officer was saying, "To all fighters, the British bombers are too far south. Everyone must land at the nearest airfield." The day was clear and sunny. As we climbed farther south, it got warmer and warmer. The boy helped me take off my fur overalls. We took our movie cameras with us and managed to capture many interesting shots as we flew over small French villages. Their inhabitants waved to us in greeting. I remember one family standing in front of a small white cottage. A young man, a tiny blonde daughter about 7 years old, and a beautiful wife. At least from 100 feet up, she seemed beautiful. Her blonde hair fluttered in the wind, and she waved at us like crazy. Elsewhere, I saw a flock of geese grazing in a meadow. Afterward, however, Johnny told me that there were some other birds. After 3 hours of flying, we began to gain altitude to get over the Alps. We were to form up in battle order over Lake Ennone, after which we were to make a final dash for Milan, 60 miles to the south. The bombs were to be dropped from an altitude of 3,000 feet. The sun was still quite high, and we could even see our own shadows running across the ground. Confusion reigned in Milan. A few anti-aircraft guns attempted to fire, but did so in some haphazard fashion. Cars were rushing through the streets. People ran for shelters. Someone turned on a searchlight, but it was all for nothing. Our guys acted like true gentlemen. They only bombed military installations that were badly damaged. But as far as I know, not a single apartment building was hit. Then we turned around and flew home. The sun was beginning to set behind the ridge of the Alps. It was a marvelous sight that I will probably never see again. Suddenly, an Italian fighter plane appeared and decided to attack us. It was an old biplane armed with 2 machine guns. We had 6 machine guns. Johnny Wickens, sitting in the tail turret, impatiently muttered, "Get closer, you bastard. Well, get closer. Come closer." The Italian, however, did not comply with his request. Soon the sun set, and we traveled the rest of the way over France without the slightest disturbance. Later that night, the Halifaxes bombed Milan again, and the panic caused by the second raid broke all records, even Italian ones. This daylight raid on Milan was simply magnificent. We struck a crushing blow to the spirit of the Italians because they relied unconditionally on the German partner, which covered Italy from the north. But then everything suddenly stopped. We switched back to Genoa. Why? Why not give the Pathfinders a break? Why cover a virtually unprotected target? Or why not try to knock Italy out of the war? There were rumors that there was some unrest in Italy. When the king visited Genoa, the people of the city were on their knees begging him to make peace. Why do we keep bombing Genoa? Why not Turin? Yes, Genoa was home to the Italian fleet, but Turin was a much more tempting target. There are far fewer brick houses there. Why bomb an Italian fleet that wasn't going to go to sea anyway? On November 8, however, we had our answer. Our troops had landed in North Africa. That's why we had to stop the Italian Navy from taking any action. From that day on, Italy was raided every time the weather permitted it. It was not only the British fogs that could stop the operation, but also the thick clouds on the tops of the Alps that made it impossible to fly over the ridges. We were assembled for briefing almost every night, but each time a meteorologist arrived with disappointing information. The maps showed the height of cloud cover over the target. The icing boundaries were marked in red pencil and safe altitudes in blue. When he unfolded the map, one of the pilots would burst out laughing nervously. Then the purpose of the flight would change, and we would go somewhere closer, like Germany. This meant turmoil, a new briefing, a hasty meeting of commanders, new flight maps, and new nervousness. We were briefed once more. And once again, the weather canceled everything. Despite the fact that only the Lancasters of our group could reach Italy, in November we lost only 2 airplanes, having made 1336 sorties there. If in peacetime someone had created an airline that sent 3 flights a day to Italy and lost only 2 airplanes in 3 years, that company would have been considered a model of reliability. Moreover, anti-aircraft guns don't fire on civilian airplanes, but they sure do on us, no matter how rarely we encounter them. In short, this operation showed the degree of reliability of British aircraft. By this time, the Italians had become very nervous. The raids were doing their job. We, as they say, hit the 10. As you know, the accuracy of bombing increases with the weakening of anti-aircraft fire. Although the Italians were given several German anti-aircraft batteries, they fired poorly. Very often we dropped bombs from the lowest safe altitude, picking targets as we wanted. I can imagine how creepy it was to see huge Lancasters roaring over the ground and dropping bombs one after another right into the target. On November 29, my crew and I dropped the first 8,000-pound bomb on Italy. This pleasure fell to Turin, and I filmed the explosion with a movie camera. After we returned home, my boys and I enjoyed watching that film. After that, the cries of Italian radio began with renewed vigor. They were complaining that we were being dishonest, that we should not use such things in air raids. They had probably forgotten Abyssinia and poison gas. "Bloody nice sight," said Johnny Serby, my new link commander. He had taken the place of Dim, who had been transferred to some secret place in London. Johnny was a little over middle age and rather taciturn, sometimes too much so, but otherwise turned out to be a lovely guy. He was married and had a young child. Johnny used to be in transport command, but desperately wanted to be in combat. He was eager to fly as much as possible. Yeah, the Italians got their asses kicked. Adjutant Charles Martin intervened. He was 45 years old and had been awarded the military medal in the last war. And during this one he'd managed to fly about 20 sorties in the Wellington's tail turret. Why he didn't get punished for that, I can't understand to this day. We were sitting in the restaurant at the Black Boy Hotel in Nottingham. The food was good, and the wine even better. Now we were smoking cigars and sipping on medium brandy. Such events helped to take our minds off the dull daily grind of airfield life. The rest of the guys, Hoppy, Bill, Brian Oliver, my new gunner, Gray Healy, Mike Linmey, his radio operator, American Don Curtin, went upstairs to the American bar. They joked and laughed with the two barmaids, chugging a horrible drink called the 106th Special. I suspect that it was made by fusing all existing spirits into one glass. We chased them away as they were being too noisy, and we wanted to sit relatively quietly. You know, it's just amazing how much the course of the war has changed, Charles said. About a year ago, our prospects looked very bleak. Last summer, they seemed even worse. Now things don't look so bad. At any rate, we're not at all afraid of losing anymore. And I wonder when it will all be over. I said more to myself than to them. Probably not soon, Charles declared. I agree, John nodded, but when you just said how things have changed since last summer, I thought you might have quietly said that the war passed the turning point on October 22, when the Russians launched their offensive at Stalingrad. November 22. Yes, between October 22 and November 22, the course of the war changed completely. The Axis forces had reached the limit of their capabilities last summer. They simply could not advance any further. First, they were stopped. They lost the initiative first at Stalingrad, then at El Alamein and in the Solomon Islands. Go on. John sipped some more brandy. Charles smoked a cigar and listened, watching the cigar smoke curl in rings. Why, you know the rest of the story yourself. On October 22, we launched a counteroffensive at El Alamein. A week later, we broke through the front and drove back the entire German army. November 8, landing in North Africa. And although I'm not completely sure about Admiral Darlan, things seem to be going well. On November 22, Timoshenko counterattacked at Stalingrad on Stalin's orders. As a result, a huge army was trapped. The Germans have suffered such losses in Russia that it makes a complete difference. In North Africa, we are advancing on both fronts. In a couple of months they will meet. After that, another German army will be destroyed, or what's left of it by then. And then we will once again completely dominate the Mediterranean. Yes, we will again dominate the sea, and then we can invade Fortress Europa. Oscar agreed. Perhaps next fall. Depends on how things go. The Russians are demanding we open a second front, but we can't do that until we eliminate the underwater danger. Besides, we'll first have to seize dominance in the air as well. The Germans have it much easier. They are trapped inside their fortress and can easily move forces to the point where the danger arises. Our task is to seize complete and unchallenged air supremacy everywhere. And the Russians don't consider the African campaign a second front. No, too few Germans are being killed there. But you don't think bombing alone can win a war, do you? Charles asked. I don't. That's the way we've been trained, as you know. However, we have to deal with the mass psychology of a nation. A nasty nation, I should point out. It is led, directed, and organized by the Gestapo and the police. They can only collapse if this iron ring is broken, or they may resist. No one can say for sure. And what if our bombardment gets stronger? You want the impossible. The Germans are an unusual people. They have never before faced the danger of devastating their country. And now they stand to lose absolutely everything without gaining anything. I think they'll fight to the end. Too many people are chattering about cracks appearing. And once a crack has appeared, the foundation must necessarily weaken and so on. They've got to the point where the British people are beginning to think how they can win the war in the easiest way possible. The Yanks have already started getting deeper and deeper into France. They've already bombed Rouen. But there's no telling where they'll stop. Probably when they reach Berlin. In the meantime, we'll be stepping up our efforts. All of Bomber Command will get Lancasters and improved Halifaxes. But even then, who's to say for sure? It's actually odd that they're still not trying to do anything in retaliation, John put in. The Canterbury raid was just such a blow in a fit of rage. From what witnesses have told me, it was clear that they attacked from a strafing angle during rush hour. The casualties among the population were enormous. Charles offered me a cigarette. Yes, it was a retaliatory raid, but I agree with what the lieutenant colonel just said. We can burn German cities, we can even flatten them to the ground, but the Germans will never end the war unless our armies enter German territory, which has never happened before as far as I can remember. It has to be an army, not some sissy army, but a real army that will tell those bastards exactly how the war will end for them. Hitler, Göring, and the rest of them should be dealt with properly. So help us God. We were silent for a while. Then I changed the subject. I think Göring is a complete idiot. He imagined that the Luftwaffe was all-powerful and prepared for a short war with a minimum of reserves. Now he has to realize that his program turned out to be wrong. All his guys are flying old airplanes with little or no armament. He's blown it. Good thing he can't hear you, Charles laughed. So we sat and smoked and talked, mostly about the war. What else? Then we started talking about the Japs. Those little yellow monkeys were bogged down too, and the balance of power at sea was beginning to shift gradually in favor of the Allies. We talked about the Japs being defeated again. We talked about submarine warfare, how airplanes with special equipment would be able to attack submarines when they didn't expect it at all. We talked about air warfare. The brandy was very conducive to casual conversation and flights of fancy. Up to this point we had traveled a long road of defeats and failures, a long road of the slope that had not been easy to travel. But now we stood at the top. It was nice to sit there and rest, thinking that the hardest part was over. Maybe now the Krauts would roll back right behind the walls of Fortress Europe. We knew it had already begun. German leaders in their speeches pointed to this as the main factor of their policy. They were going to turn all of Europe into an indestructible fortress capable of withstanding an endless siege until war fatigue and internal strife forced the Allies to give up trying to crack the too hard nut. The exploitation of the conquered territories became so brutal that it shocked even the local quislings. Italians, Hungarians, Romanians, and others were being sent to the Russian front in droves. Cold-blooded murder and unheard-of brutality were to finally end the Jews as a nation. France was forced to begin full-scale cooperation with the Axis powers. Adolf Hitler himself was outlawed. But we had to attack Festung Europa, and we were to break into it for the first time. Only then could we speak to the German people in the language of the sword. Their own language, the only language they could understand. Only then were we to break the entire worldview system of the Germans. After that, it was the turn of the Japanese. That, too, would take a long time, but they, too, would eventually pay for their aggression. "Looks like it's going to happen," Johnny said, yawning. "Someday we'll land on the continent." "The key word is someday." "Great word," said Charles. We got up and went out. It had been a pleasant evening, and we had already won the war. We would have been much less pleased, however, if we had imagined the hard battles that still lay ahead of us and the heavy sacrifices we would make, and that the war would prove to be a very long one. The situation had changed, but we had a long way to go. The raids on Italy ended as abruptly as they began, at least for our group. We started bombing the Ruhr Valley again. Still, single Halifaxes and Sterlings continued to travel south of the Alps to drop a few tons of bombs on the industrial areas of Turin and Genoa. However, these were sporadic sorties rather than systematic raids. As part of our group, we took part in a raid on Milan when my 106th Squadron broke all previous records by getting 6 point-of-aim shots. This was the third accomplishment in the history of Bomber Command. But, as far as the overall situation was concerned, Italy was over, and the battle for Germany had begun. Very little had been accomplished in Germany in the intervening months. The bomber squadrons were doing something somewhere, but the scientists were not sitting idle. These were not long-haired, personable old men, as you might think. They were very ordinary people, sometimes young, sometimes middle-aged. They couldn't fly themselves, but they did us a great deal of good. First of all, they helped us stop being afraid of the weather. For months they fought with the KV transmitters, trying to get them to work reliably. And they succeeded. Toward the end of December, Captain Bob Hay came from Group Headquarters to tell us how it was done. He was speaking in our pre-flight briefing room in front of a large slate board on which were drawn numerous complicated diagrams. "Since the beginning of the war, you've been bombing some targets on the ground," he began. I looked at John Serby and grinned. Of course we were bombing something on the ground there. Why did we need bombs anyway? If you can see the target well, you do your best to hit it. But when the target is covered by clouds, what can you do? You can only drop the bombs the moment you are calculated to be over the target. But that means you'll throw them away in vain. Muffled exclamations were heard, and everyone prepared to listen. Now we have something new to offer you. You will be bombing through clouds, bombing practically blind. You will have to aim at something in the air. That something is a sort of colored flare that will be fired by a targeting plane right above the aiming point on the ground. Bomb the flares. Someone chuckled, but Bob nonchalantly continued. And there's nothing to laugh about. Listen to the end. These flares will be fired by the Pathfinders, which have already practiced similar operations during the exercise. I can't tell you how they do it. They're using some kind of secret equipment. To the delight of the bombardiers, I can tell you that you will be using normal sights, although you will have to use slightly unfamiliar baselines. Then he went on in his dry manner to explain the technical details: wind speed, airplane speed, angles of advance, and 1,000 other little things that a bombardier must keep in mind when working with a modern sight. Gone are the days when Royal Air Force bombardiers worked with 1932-style sights. Now they had Mark XIV sights. This sight could do just about anything. You could fly at any altitude at any speed. You could dive. But the little horoscopes, spinning at many thousands of revolutions per minute, compensated for everything except wind speed. So the bombs always lay close to the target. We considered our new sights almost omnipotent. One of the most ardent supporters of the new tactics was Gus Walker. He had suffered a lot during the bombing of Germany in bad weather, received there his Distinguished Service Order and Distinguished Flying Cross, and therefore knew all these mechanics from the inside. But unfortunately, circumstances were such that Gus did not get to see the new system in action. It was one of the worst nights I can remember. We were supposed to send some planes out, but dusk fell and visibility began to deteriorate rapidly. About 30 airplanes were rolling around the perimeter of the airfield, waiting for another to take off. Gus and I watched this confusion from the control tower. Suddenly, we saw several incendiary bombs fall out of the Lancaster's open bomb bay on the opposite edge of the airfield. Gus thought the bomber might have heavy bombs on board and immediately rushed to warn the crew so people could jump out of the plane in time. I saw the car rush right across the airfield, skipping under the noses of the planes taking off. But we knew it was a backup airplane, and in any case I needed to stay in the flight control center. Through binoculars, I saw Gus jump out of the car and run toward the plane. In the lighter light, you could see him waving his arms. He was already 20 yards from the plane when the bombs went off. It was one of those slow-motion horrific explosions where the entire shock wave goes straight up and the flames soar 2,000 feet high. The huge Lancaster just disappeared. We turned away, trying not to think about the horrible picture we had seen. Everyone was sure that Gus had gone to heaven. However, it was not so easy to handle him. He was thrown back about 200 yards. Gus's right forearm was severed by a huge piece of metal, but he got to his feet on his own and went to the dressing station. 10 members of the fire department were injured. Since I was temporarily acting base commander, I ordered all medical personnel to get to their feet to save people. The base's senior medic was absent, but our physician, Dr. Arnold, worked real miracles. Soon all the injured were bandaged up, given morphine to dull the pain, and were feeling relatively normal. Gus's wife, who had seen the explosion, rushed over. I think she realized something terrible had happened. I can't describe the look on her face when she learned that Gus was alive. Before he was taken to the base hospital, he said 2 things. First, he asked me to look for his severed arm, since he had new chevrons stitched on his tunic. And he also asked me to call the air group commander to find a vacant position for the one-armed base commander within 2 months. Gus came back the same day he promised. It wasn't until the end of the year that we began using the air marker bombing technique in our raids on the Ruhr Valley. Our target was the Krupp factories in Essen. Although air raid sirens had sounded hundreds of times in the small town, but so far only a few bombs had fallen on the factory. Now it was time to try out the tactics of blind bombing. 25 planes were involved in the operation, dropping bombs from an altitude of 23,000 feet. Our forces were small, one might even say dangerously small. But such were the requirements of the new method, in which the bombers are obliged to meet the allotted and rather limited time. I received a lot of advice from the squadron commander of the Pathfinders. You must take off and gain as much altitude as possible within an hour. Then, at exactly the specified moment, you must set a course for Amaden. There you must turn and fly straight to point X, where 2 yellow flares will be burning in front of you. They will be dropped 25 miles from the target. You will have to fly perfectly straight without making any maneuvers until you get to point I. There you will see 2 red rockets and you will have to pass between them. After a few minutes, a bunch of green missiles will appear right on your course. You'll have to aim right at them, keeping a heading of 170 degrees according to the magnetic compass. It doesn't matter too much if you are a couple minutes late in dropping the bombs, as the wind is very light and will not blow the bombs more than a mile away. However, it is very important to maintain an accurate course when bombing. If you veer off to the side by 10 degrees, the bombs will explode at least 10 miles from the target. We took off, located all the flares and bombed them, then came back, driving through the densest anti-aircraft fire since the beginning of the war. We ran into a lot of trouble and many airplanes had to go back. So far we had not flown at extreme altitudes. The planes that came back were under fire from over 1,500 anti-aircraft guns for half an hour, which was quite unpleasant. At -60 Fahrenheit, oxygen masks failed, engines overheated, machine gun turrets froze to the rails, and ice covered the wing planes. Only 10 out of 25 planes managed to reach the target and drop bombs. But the next day, German radio for the first time in the entire war recognized that at night, several enemy bombers bombed the city of Essen. This was only the beginning. From that day on, the entire air group began to use the new tactics, although constantly faced with various difficulties. The very idea was right. All failures were the result of the fact that they had to act in extreme conditions. The commander of the air group quickly achieved the installation of new cowls, which prevented the engines from overheating. The mechanics improved the oxygen masks, and they no longer failed. All turret mechanics were thoroughly cleaned of lubricating oil that froze at high altitudes. The crews received electrically heated flight suits, so the pilots, especially the gunners, no longer suffered from frost. But despite all this, we suffered very heavy losses. Although 25 airplanes had to drop bombs on the target within about 30 seconds, Essen was located many anti-aircraft guns, so a real barrage of steel fell on each of the bombers. In one night, my squadron lost 3 airplanes and 3 fine crews. However, the bombs started falling on Essen even through the veil of clouds, and the Germans became worried. They too began to use a novelty, new anti-aircraft shells, which we called Victoria. Their bursting resembled the famous gesture of our Prime Minister. However, they thought in vain that these shells will be able to stop the increasing power of our strikes. And a few weeks later, our scientists gave another novelty. It was a marker bomb. In shape, it resembled an ordinary 250-pound bomb, which exploded 3,000 feet above the ground and threw out hundreds of glowing red balls, which burned for 5 minutes. What's more, we could change the color of these balloons at any time, so the enemy simply couldn't slip us a false target. We called these bombs target indicator bombs, or simply TI for short. The new marker bombs put night bombing on a higher plane. From this point on, Our plan began to take shape. The individual pieces of the puzzle that we had been putting together for 3.5 years finally began to come together into a coherent picture. With the onset of the new year began regular raids, which meant the end of the quiet life of German cities. The number of bombers was constantly growing. The weight of the bombs they dropped increased. Concentration of the maximum number of aircraft and strict timekeeping were the key to success. On January 13, the target of the raid was again Essen. The TI markers were clearly visible to the crews even from high altitude. An unheard-of number of bombs fell on the city and its environs. On January 16 and 17, Berlin was raided. Here again, we encountered difficulties, as the long distance led to some navigational errors. The markers were dropped 6 miles south of the city center, and so it was mainly the suburbs of Berlin that suffered, but the destruction there was simply terrible. Things are moving. Although we were a bit lost, we gradually found the right road. Within a month, all the crews had mastered the new tactics. After that, our target was Lorient, where most of the submarine bunkers were located. These raids were particularly devastating. The entire port and surrounding areas of the city were simply wiped out. The raids on Lorient took place in the face of not too much enemy resistance. This allowed the crews to thoroughly learn the new tactics of bombing in combat, which later proved very useful in raids on German cities with their strong air defense. Once the new tactics were understood and internalized, the bomber guys took on the Ruhr again. A real air battle was played out over Essen. Krupp factories were subjected to 3 massive raids and were almost destroyed. One after another, Nuremberg, Cologne, Dusseldorf, and other cities were hit. The Germans finally managed to find an answer. As soon as German firefighters spotted TIS falling from the sky, they immediately rushed there, since it was perfectly safe to be directly under the marker, and extinguished them. The new year brought a lot of sad news to the German people, in addition to increased air raids. The news reported by the Berlin radio was very alarming. The Russians had launched a general offensive. On January 31, the German 6th Army under General Paulus surrendered at Stalingrad. Black flags were displayed in Berlin. In Tunisia, the British and American armies also launched an offensive against German positions. It looked as if the Axis forces would soon be thrown into the sea. But since they did not have a strong navy, they should not have hoped for a safe evacuation like the one we conducted at Dunkirk. At Casablanca, there was a conference of the Supreme Command of the Allied forces. It was decided to demand from the enemy full and unconditional surrender. And after Casablanca, the Germans were prepared for something else. General Eicher's pilots began daylight raids on Germany, using flying fortresses. The Americans had won their battle, and now the future of the Luftwaffe began to look doubtful. The Germans only knew that the Americans had succeeded in a daylight raid on Wilhelmshaven, but they had no doubt that Göring would soon drive these scoundrels away. The Germans did not even realize how cruelly misguided they were. No one informed them that in March 1943 their submarines suffered a major defeat in the Atlantic. Thanks to the use of new secret equipment and weapons at sea, in the air and underwater, our ships were now coming to England and North Africa with virtually no losses. The only thing the Germans knew was that the systematic devastation of their country had begun. However, there was still nothing they could change, no matter what their propaganda claimed. Very quickly, Goebbels changed the tone of his speeches. Instead of hiding the extent of the destruction, he began to exaggerate it, so that the whole world began to look at strategic aviation as a weapon of murderers. Here is an example of an article from a German newspaper of the time. We know from our own sad experience that our cities are subjected to terrorist raids, and the civilian population suffers heavy losses, at times very heavy. We cannot fulfill the demands of the public, however much we would like to, and publish the actual figures of our losses. The fact is that the enemy must not know the true results of their raids. These figures are high, but we must emphasize again that they must not cause alarm and serve as an aid to the fomenters of panic in the Reich. Many of our cities have been partially destroyed by enemy terrorist raids, although for a long time they were considered safe because fog or concealed locations, or some other factors, prevented the enemy from observing or even detecting them at all. But now the enemy has managed to find some of these towns and strike them and their inhabitants. Yes, we found and bombed those cities despite the fog and thick clouds. We had broken the resistance of the weather god who had so far helped the enemy. It was the turn of the Germans to weep. Yes, now they began to scream and wail, calling even the Pope for help to stop the raids. But they should have remembered Warsaw, Rotterdam, Coventry, Bristol, Plymouth, Glasgow, Swansea, and London. They had already forgotten Hitler's promise to burn all British cities and destroy the British people. Yes, they turned out to have a very short memory, but that is a typical character trait of the Croats. Year after year, they unleashed all the horrors of war on the defenseless cities of Europe, drenching them in blood, starving them to death, shooting the inhabitants. They did this for 150 years, but they could not imagine that their own cities could suffer the same fate. For them, the war was a series of victories far from home. The first to be hit were those German cities that were closest to the bases of our bombers. But soon there were new devices that allowed us to accurately drop TI markers even at the limit of the range of the Lancaster. The towns in the Ruhr Valley began to fade away. Normally a thick fog hung over the river valley, but now it was no longer concealment. Factories were destroyed one by one. Panic-stricken workers abandoned them. But to destroy an entire industrial district is difficult even for a large number of bombers. Nevertheless, the work began. Our command began planning another raid, which was to completely stop production in the Ruhr Valley. Only a few people knew that our scientists had begun work on a new weapon. Orders were given, tests were soon to begin, but so far all this was kept in the strictest secrecy. Fascist propaganda paid great attention to the actions of British air pirates. It did not spare swear words and threatened the most severe penalties to our pilots. But despite all attempts to hide the truth, the neutral press from Germany leaked information from which it became clear that the damage from our raids is quite large. Some of the reports were hard to believe. Perhaps the correspondents had given free rein to their imagination. Perhaps they had friends in Poland, Greece, and Yugoslavia. Here is an example of such a note, describing the fate of a German city, written by a neutral correspondent. British bombing has turned a people accustomed to a high standard of living into troglodytes. More than 2 million people live in dugouts, tents, and ruins, or in wretched wooden huts. In addition, tens of thousands are anxiously awaiting the moment when they too will lose the roof over their heads. It should be added that these 2 million are all that remains of a population of 5 million. The rest have scattered all over the country. 500,000 have fled to Poland, hundreds of thousands to Pomerania and South Germany, and several 100,000 more to Thuringia and Czechoslovakia. All of them live in dreadful overcrowding, their despair growing. They are oppressed by the creation that they have become outcasts, and they cease to trust anyone. They have long since stopped listening to the comforting statements of propaganda, which persists in trying to make them believe that victory is still possible. The problem of looting has emerged. Clothes and furniture are disappearing from bombed-out houses with incredible speed. Entire closets, heavy pianos, buffets of silverware and china are disappearing. The authorities do not even try to dispute these facts, but in the name of national pride, they try to attribute all this to foreign workers. Of course, it is possible to find a lousy sheep among them, but how can you hide a closet, a cupboard, or a piano in the barracks where the vast majority of them live? The people of these cities live in constant fear. Fear of the police, fear of bombs, fear of robbers, fear of foreign laborers. All misfortunes that cannot otherwise be explained are attributed to the latter. For example, recently there have been gangs of saboteurs who walk through streets devoid of lights and remove sewer manhole covers. The results of such tomfoolery are easy to imagine. Bombing victims, rescue teams, even police and firefighters fall through manholes. Someone cleans out the street payphones. Fire mains are sealed with cement. How is all this done? Who organizes it? Who does the work? Where do our bombers aim if they cause such destruction? We never thought we could win the war by bombing alone. We had to destroy German industry, destroy their transportation system, stop the building of submarines, make the canals impassable with mines. We were to bomb Germany until it weakened and began to faint from our blows. Then our invasion armies would easily crush her. This would help save thousands of lives of our soldiers, young men on whom the future of our countries depended. This was the situation in March 1943, when the Allies' grand strategy shifted to the offensive. It was the year when Nazi domination was brought to an end. The Americans, with their inexhaustible industrial capabilities, began to build a bomber air force that soon surpassed ours. They relied on daytime raids. We continued to advocate night raids, so bombing raids continued around the clock. One city after another was raided until there was nothing left, until the Luftwaffe was scattered into dust. That was precisely the goal of Bomber Command. And the day would come when 4,000 airplanes would simultaneously appear over Berlin. How was this done? Let's try to tell you briefly about Bomber Command. At its head was Air Chief Marshal Harris, assisted by a group of advisors. They made a major contribution to the battle over Germany. He would hold meetings with his staff, then get weather forecasts from specialists, after which he would decide that the target today would be Berlin, point X. Then he would make a phone call and solicit the opinion of all air group commanders. He was a tough man, Air Chief Marshal Harris. He looked even tougher when he was yelling on the phone. His glasses could move down to the tip of his nose when he pointed his finger at some point on a map of Berlin. He would say over the phone, "Hello, who's there? Is that you, Alec? Okay, you're aiming at point X today." Then he'd say a code word into the phone that meant Berlin. "Get all planes in the air. Maximum effort. You will receive detailed instructions within the hour." That's it. Goodbye. From the office of the commander of the air group went the order to the operational department of the group headquarters, from there to the bases and squadrons. The squadron commander, as a rule, served as a fairly young man who was entrusted with a serious responsibility. He would sit perfectly still, listening to orders, and then press the bell button, summoning two squadron commanders. They entered the office, sliding their caps to the back of their heads, smoking cigarettes, and cast the commander a questioning look. "Berlin tonight," the squadron commander reported. "All airplanes, maximum load." A few minutes later, the roar of the engines of the Lancasters was heard on the airfield. One plane after another rose into the air to check the serviceability of all systems in flight. Bombers had to spend in the air for half an hour each while checking everything. Tested radios, machine guns, navigational tools, bomb throwers. Sometimes for practice even dropped a couple of bombs to check the work of the sites. After landing, the pilots went to lunch. They had a quick snack, not thinking about anything. Everyone kept quiet, and the squadron commander quite often did not have time to eat. The telephone went off almost continuously. Then began the pre-flight briefing. Here all the necessary information was brought to the crews who were to take part in the night show. The room was packed to capacity. The guys came in their favorite sweaters that didn't look anything like uniforms. There were usually a couple of war correspondents or some army officers sitting in the corner. The squadron commander would enter, followed by the senior navigator, and conversation would instantly cease. When silence was established, the commander would begin. "All right, boys, sit down. Today is Berlin, aiming point X. It is located in the center of the territory of the factory that produces Daimler-Benz engines. You can find it on your maps." He pointed to this point on a map of Berlin. There are 700 bombers involved in today's raid. These are all four-engine machines, as twin-engine machines simply won't make it. Each plane will carry a 4,000-pound bomb and 16 lighters. The total weight will be about 2,000 tons. They should get a good hit. The meteorologist says the skies will be clear the whole way, which is incredible. Let's hope he's not wrong. The Pathfinders intend to attack from Z1, to Z plus 35. It should be a short, massive strike. You will bomb from 21,000 feet. Don't bunch up at that altitude, or you will start colliding in the air. That's it. We're lucky we won't be in the lower echelon. Those guys have yet to see our bombs flying down. The route is normal. You can see it here on the board. The navigator will tell you about the Pathfinder's actions. Then the commander nods his head toward the navigator. Go ahead. The squadron navigator, a big fat man with a distinguished flying cross ribbon, comes forward and begins to speak. Time Z is set for 19.45. At Z3 time, the Pathfinders will drop a string of red markers indicating the target. After 120 seconds, they will change color to green. At this point, they will indicate a point that is 15 miles from the aiming point on the ground. At a speed relative to the ground of 240 miles per hour, this equals 3 minutes and 45 seconds of flight time. The time should be counted in seconds. If someone is late, they will surely miss, so pilots must be very precise in their speed. The TI marker will go down exactly at the moment of Z1 and will lie directly on the roofs of the factory. There will be green markers in the sky in case the Ts on the ground are hidden by fog or smoke. After the briefing, have all navigators come to me, and I'll point out courses and intervals to them. Then he turns to the squadron commander, who steps forward again to give final orders. Don't forget, guys, when you get out to the first target marker, you are to turn to a course of 135 degrees on the magnetic compass and follow it for 4 minutes. You are not to make any maneuvers and follow straight to the target. Once you drop the bombs, you may turn slightly and pick up speed on the descent. The Pathfinders will drop a bunch of green and red markers 30 miles from Berlin. You must reassemble at this point to follow home together. Try not to get separated from the group. So far our losses have been quite small, and we should not break that tradition tonight. Remember to keep your tails up in case any fighters appear from below. I think that's it. When you approach the base, don't disturb the landing order. I'll meet you in the break room just before your flight. That's it. The guys noisily leave the room. For some of them, this is their first combat flight, and they look anxious. The veterans are completely unfazed, sure they're having a tea party, though inside they're worried too. After the briefing, a reporter approaches the squadron commander to ask a few questions. Why such a concentration of forces? What is the idea behind it? The commander is very busy at the moment, however, he does give a full answer. There are very many anti-aircraft guns located on German territory, which are guided by short-wave stations. Therefore, if an airplane flies past the battery every 5 minutes, the guns will follow it. The same applies to night fighters. But if all airplanes fly by more or less simultaneously, anti-aircraft guns will not be able to choose their target. The same will happen with the guidance system of night fighters. As a result of such actions, casualties are reduced. Moreover, the bombs lay down in a more heap than when the planes drop them singly. What about collisions? Asks the correspondent. There shouldn't be any, if they stay exactly on course, and if the Pathfinders drop the markers on time. Sometimes there are overlaps. During the raid on Stuttgart, the Pathfinders were 15 minutes late, so 400 bombers circled the target, waiting for them. 18 didn't make it back. Some died in the collisions, I believe. The time after the briefing passes uneventfully. No one knows what to do. Some sit in the mess hall, listening to the radio, and wishing they were far away from here. A few people are playing pool, but most of the pilots are just sitting in their chairs, flipping through newspapers and looking at their watches. They're waiting for it to be time to go change. But time crawls slowly. Minutes seem like hours. The only busy people are the squadron commander and his squadron leaders. First, they call from the group headquarters, reminding them that the squadron must lift the maximum number of aircraft. Then the engineer calls and says that the engine on S. Charlie is broken. Maybe it should be transferred to the reserve. Okay, that's what we'll do. A call from the weapons chief. The Z Zebra has had a spontaneous bomb drop. Is everything all right? Yes, everything's fine. Then check it again. There's a leak in the oxygen system on the G. George. The mechanics will have to hurriedly install new oxygen tanks just before departure. And so on. The phone rings incessantly. The commander has absolutely no free time. Meanwhile, the pilots begin to change before the flight. They have to put on many sets of underwear and electrically heated coveralls before going to their planes. The guys all look carefree, but it's only a mask hiding their true feelings. Still, they will be completely at ease when they take their seats on the airplanes. Give it to them. Lads, says the Australian, who is not flying today. One member of his crew is sick. Then the takeoff begins. It is an exhilarating sight. Exactly at the appointed time, the planes begin to taxi. First comes the squadron commander's car with a brightly colored emblem in the nose. The planes line up on the runway one by one, like a brood of ducks, seeing them off waving their hands. Then the pilot slams the cockpit window shut and gives the throttle. The ground beneath them begins to rumble and shake as if in an earthquake. Lancasters one after another run down the runway fringed with lights and then melt into the gloom. In a field on a neighboring farm, a worker sits in the cab of a tractor. He has just finished plowing and is now ready to head home. Dinner is waiting for him. Looking up, he sees hundreds of spots above, little black specks that rise higher and higher into the night sky. Then he nods and says under his breath, "They flew again tonight. I hope they give the bastards a hard slap. Maybe they'll all come back again. God bless them. They're all great guys." With that, he starts the tractor and rolls home. At the bus stop in a neighboring town, two girls are standing at the bus stop. One says to the other, "They flew away again. I'm going to hope they come back early. Otherwise they'll wake me up." And here's what happens in one of the airplanes in the air. It has gained the required altitude, and the flight mechanic turns down the revs, bringing the engines to cruising mode. "Hello, navigator. This is the commander calling. How long do we have to fly to the rendezvous point?" The navigator quickly looks at the map. "We're 6 miles from it. If you circle for another 5 minutes and then turn there at 240 miles per hour, we'll be there on time." "Oh, okay," the commander agreed. "Tail gunner, everything okay?" "Yes," comes the reply from the tail of the plane. 5 minutes later, the commander touches the wheel, and the blunt nose of the Lancaster turns east. At the same moment, all the other bombers do the same, and the flight lights of a multitude of bombers flash at different altitudes. They gather at the rendezvous point about 2 hours before time Z. They arrive at this point almost simultaneously, and then all the flight lights go out at the same time, and the aerial armada sets course for Berlin. To describe a huge formation of bombers flying in a single formation is very difficult. But imagine a glass brick 2 miles wide, 20 miles long, and 8,000 feet high, packed with hundreds of Lancasters. It moves slowly toward the Dutch shore, and the planes gradually rearrange themselves in waves. Soon the Dutch shore will show itself, even, perhaps, too soon. The time is 5 p.m. at this point. The Gruppen and Staffeln of the night squadrons, scattered throughout Germany, begin to receive orders. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and other fighters are prepared for departure. They took fuel and ammunition. Pilots and ground personnel are tensely waiting. Any of the airfields are ready to receive, instantly refuel, and rearm any aircraft. Everything is ready so that the night fighters can operate without the slightest delay. At this time, on the German anti-aircraft batteries and searchlight sites are still all quiet. The shell cellars, emptied during the last raid, are full again. The huge dynamos powering the searchlights are ready to go to work. It is only necessary to turn the switch. And then a whole stream of power, enough to power a small town, will turn into a beam of light that rises into the black night sky. The sentries near the huge 88mm anti-aircraft guns walk slowly back and forth, peering upward. Soon it will be completely dark. The sky is covered with heavy clouds, and the young moon is not going to rise yet. but even its light will not be able to penetrate the canopy of clouds. The English prefer nights like this for raids. 17.40. Luftwaffe headquarters near Berlin receives a message from the coast. Alarm bells are ringing. A strong formation of British bombers is crossing the Dutch coast. After that, phone calls bring the entire air defense system of the continent to its feet. The night fighters in Holland have already taken to the air and are searching for the enemy. Also moving eastward, they attach themselves to groups of British planes, and the first skirmishes begin. But this is only a prelude to the big air battle. The ground staff of the many German airfields are feverishly preparing the last planes to roll out onto the runways. Near a large glass map stand young girls of the Luftwaffe auxiliary units wearing headphones and with laryngophones around their necks. In their hands they have wax pencils, with which they mark the position of enemy aircraft. From the control center, only vague shadows moving behind a glass screen are visible. On a huge map appear more and more new arrows and circles, disappear old marks. Every officer and soldier has taken his place. Everyone knows exactly what they have to do, and the whole huge mechanism is working smoothly. The glass map shows that the enemy is approaching from several directions, but it is already clear that his main forces are moving to the east. Enemy bombers cross the border of West Germany. Suddenly, they turn to the southeast. Several small groups head south toward the Rhine. A series of bombs fall on two towns. Maybe this is the beginning of a major attack targeting these cities, or maybe it's just a ploy to distract the German night fighters from the true target. The enemy hopes that the wrong orders will help them gain a few precious minutes so that the main bomber force can break into the prescribed area. There they will be met by weakened night fighter formations. The guidance officer has to deal with many problems and issues simultaneously, weighing attack and defense options, making decisions in an ever-changing situation while keeping the commander informed. British bombers are still moving towards central Germany. The British main force makes another turn and flies eastward again. The last observer report reads, "Vanguard of enemy bombers in the Dora Heinkel Square, heading east." 18.30. At this moment, the fighter unit X, whose planes are already standing on the runway with engines running, receives the order. Group X, take off. Move in the direction of the light beacon Y. A few minutes later, the planes are already rushing over the ground. Quickly gaining altitude, they fly in the direction of the flashing beacon Y. The subway is still running in Berlin. Life flows as usual. The residents of the city receive their first warning. The bright lights at the marshalling yards go out. The huge city is gradually sinking into darkness. Meanwhile, the British are flying north of the first of the major cities of central Germany. In less than an hour they will be over Berlin. At an altitude of 6,500 meters, menacingly roaring engines of heavy bombers flying eastward. 18.45. Message in the headphones. The enemy has already lost 7 aircraft before reaching Osnabrück. The remaining night fighter units have prepared to take off to defend the capital. The meteorologist quickly gives a picture of the weather over Germany. Cloudless skies over the southern areas where the night fighters will land after the battle. Meanwhile, the night fighter units, which are concentrated in certain areas, begin to close in on the enemy. German fighters have already made contact with several groups of bombers. Anti-aircraft batteries around Berlin are ordered to prepare. 19.16. The enemy is 100 kilometers from Berlin. A large number of night fighters are escorting British planes. The commander sits next to the intelligence officer. To resolve matters more quickly, he contacts the commander of another air defense district. Priority of command has X city. In a matter of seconds, the telephonists establish the connection. On a large glass map, the arrows are pulling closer and closer to Berlin. The position of the night fighters is precisely known. 19.41. What if the enemy is coming straight for Berlin? 19.43. Open fire heavy anti-aircraft batteries located west of the capital. It is still impossible to say whether the mass of enemy bombers will continue to move towards Berlin or turn towards Leipzig. Over the central part of the city, enemy planes are dropping cascades of colored rockets. Over the suburbs appear large groups of planes. Up flies a fountain of high explosive shells aimed at the bombers. Despite the weather problems, night fighters continue the hunt. In the bright beams of searchlights clearly visible British planes, the enemy drops bombs on the industrial areas of the city and then try to get away as quickly as possible. At high speed, German fighters chase them and shoot down as many as they can. Above, the lead plane of the Pathfinder circles. How far are we from the target? Navigator. About 25 miles. Okay, get the pre-marker ready. Ready. A voice from the center turret. Anti-aircraft guns firing from left rear. Okay. The guns rumble below. Ahead lies Berlin, dark and silent. Berlin is like a huge lurking mouse, afraid to move and just petrified. Suddenly, it awakens to life. Hundreds of flashes of gunfire flash on rooftops. Anti-aircraft guns open fire in parks and train stations. Hold still, for Christ's sake, Commander. 1 more minute, says the navigator. The captain's voice is heard again. Okay. No one speaks for long. Both hands are on the wheel, eyes peering into the darkness to detect danger in time. And in his soul lives the hope that there will be no danger. His plane seems just huge, the only one in the sky, and all the guns below seem aimed at him. The flashes of gunfire are short and angry. And down below at the Germans, he appears first on the cathode ray tube screen as a small speck. The civilians have long since taken refuge in shelters, but the civil defense, police, and firemen begin to listen nervously to the noise of the approaching enemy's engines. Approaching, Commander. Smooth. Approach. 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 Got it. Okay. TIE marker dropped. A few seconds later it explodes, scattering sparks across the ground. A huge mass of green orbs that glowed brightly in the gloom. The bombers got a perfect aiming point. Air, one of the strike formation's planes. There they are, Commander, just ahead, exclaims the bombardier. Perfect. The Pathfinders have arrived on time. The navigator looks at the chronometer and gives the command. The bombardier starts counting down. 3 minutes and 20 seconds should pass. On all other planes, bombardiers do the same. Bombers lie down on a combat course, breaking through the steel curtain. Anti-aircraft guns are firing from all sides. Black balls of explosions appear in the sky here and there. Flickering beams of searchlights, trying to catch the enemy. The bombardier starts counting down. 3 minutes, Commander. The formation moves like a column of battleships. Above, hundreds of fighter searchlights flicker to illuminate the bombers. Ju-88s and Mi-110s rush at the enemy like a swarm of poisonous black bees. The sky is full of multicolored trails, some flying up, others going down. Some of the trails are going horizontal as one of our gunners opened fire. 2 minutes to go. More flares are coming down, and it is getting brighter than daylight. The dazzling beams of the searchlights are barely visible in the flickering glow of the many flares. Now multicolored tracer bullets flicker right and left, above and below. Some bombers explode after taking a direct hit, huge balls of flame slowly unfolding in the sky. Leaving behind them a tail of black smoke, they fly towards the ground. 1 minute to go. The bomb hatch flaps open. The bombardier continues to count. 50 seconds. 40 seconds. Explosions, anti-aircraft shells, literally everywhere. But the leading group of bombers did not lose formation, although several aircraft shot down. The survivors continue to go to the target, but the brief moments of combat course stretches for a lifetime. Again, the voice of the bombardier is heard. Red TI, right on course. Good sighting, air marker 2. 30 seconds. Strictly horizontal flight. Someone ahead flares up. A whole handful of lighters spill right onto the markers. The lighters lay in a chain a mile long, but from up high it looks no longer than a cane. 20 seconds. Level hold. Let's go bombs. shouts the bombardier. You can hear the relief in his voice. Lancaster, getting rid of the load, literally jumps forward and begins to descend, gaining speed. However, it continues to fly over the burning city. The throttle sectors are thrown forward to the full, and the engines roar deafeningly. Their rumble is painful to the ears. And below, the volcano begins to erupt. A multitude of lighters are scattered around the ground markers, which are already beginning to go out. Puffs of black smoke rise upward, but new markers explode in the air and smoothly descend into the target area where the flames are already raging. The bombers are therefore able to aim for certain. The heavy bombs burst one after the other, and the dim red flashes of bursts are clearly visible from the heights. Each plane is taking pictures. Below, as if hell opened up, when the target is the last group of bombers, the fires caused by the first, blazing all over. Against the background of flames from above clearly visible airplanes flying over the doomed city, anti-aircraft fire begins to subside, searchlights go out. Once again, the air defense system has lost the battle. A few flyers spin in the firelight, but they immediately burst into tongues of flame shooting out of the windows of the destroyed houses. Soon the entire attacked neighborhood turns into a solid sea of fire, and the last bomber drops its bombs. The British planes gather at rendezvous points, and the survivors turn for home. This is how it was all done by very young lads who had courage, skill, and got good equipment. The Germans did everything in their power to stop the British, but in vain. They had too many factors to consider. They were distracted by false attacks. Bombers flew in several waves. They could arrive at 1-hour intervals throughout the night, and German fighters simply could not stay in the air that long. And each raid used all the new inventions of British scientists, which helped to cope with the German air defense. This was just the beginning. 3 years of experimentation had come to an end. The right answer to all questions had been found, and the bomber aviation was finally able to strike for real. It could choose between strategic and tactical targets that were equally vulnerable to bombs.